also, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Anyhow,
Okay.
anyway, yes.
Hi, Josie. Thanks for joining us, Josie.
Hi, Gendry. Wish you all the
Appreciate it.
best.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Josie. So,
Okay, folks, we're on. Yes.
So do we begin? Is it time to begin? Beginning, Teresa?
Over to you.
Thank you. Fantastic. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're watching, and welcome to this workshop presented by Good Shepherd Australia New Zealand on understanding the impact of COVID on vulnerable Australians. To begin our time together, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands we are meeting on. We honour their traditions and custodianship as being the oldest continuous culture in the world. I pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and any elders that may be present with us today. This is so exciting to be beginning our 2 weeks of forums at the United Nations CSW65 conference. My name is Gendry Klein-Bretler, and I'm the Mission Director at Good Shepherd Australia New Zealand, and I'll be facilitating the session for you today. So there isn't a country in the world that has not been in some way impacted by last year's COVID-19 experience. For those in our communities who were already vulnerable, the impact was devastating. At the same time, we saw a new cohort of people who became vulnerable, many for the first time. Good Shepherd Australia New Zealand has collated the insights we gathered from people's experience of COVID during 2020. I'd like to read you a little quote from our paper that we wrote about this topic. The writers who are with us today, Susan and Zara, say, the onset of the global coronavirus pandemic quickly brought everyday life for most people to a halt. Across Australia, stay-at-home orders were announced. For some, the disruption was minimal, moving work from an office environment to a home setting. But for many Good Shepherd clients, many of whom experience high levels of complexity and disadvantage, the story was very seldom straightforward. So the emotional, physical and mental experience will have been different in each country that we are from in this room, in this Zoom room. Australia's experience will be radically different from yours. So I suggest that during the session, if you have a pen and paper with you, note down some thoughts. Note down any similarities you are hearing, or what was different for your community or country than from Australia, and any questions that arise for you during the session, because at the end we'll have some time to share. So today we are sharing the impacts of COVID from the Australian context. Let's begin with our first presenter, and I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Zara Lasseter, who is the Head of Research and Advisory at Good Shepherd Australia New Zealand. And Zara will share with you insights into the general impact of COVID-19 on Australians. Thanks for joining us, Zara, and over to you.
Thank you, Gendry. I'd like to welcome everyone and also say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I think it's important when we think about what's happened in this space to again acknowledge country, as Gendry has done. Country is something that is very important, and myself being from the United States and also being a First Nations person with Sioux heritage, I'd like to also acknowledge being here in Australia and acknowledge the First Nation peoples. In terms of what we'd like to do today, Susan and I have broken our presentation into two parts. Some of you may be aware of our organization, so Good Shepherd Australia New Zealand, and others of you who may be seeing this on YouTube or may come to this area later may not. So I'm just going to give you a very, very brief preface to introduce you to Good Shepherd. So Good Shepherd's mission is to tackle the significant issues impacting women, girls, and families. Our vision is for all women, girls, and families to be safe, well, strong, and connected. As such, we are not for profit, and we offer a range of services to the community Australia-wide. These services include microfinance services, family violence services, parenting programs, and other range, including financial counseling that is available for people around the financial well-being area. In terms of the presentation itself, as I said to you earlier, there are two parts. My part will cover off an understanding at a population-wide level of some of the impacts of COVID-19 on what we're terming the new vulnerable Australians. I will then dig a bit deeper into what the needs were for those Australians who were newly vulnerable, as well as thinking through what that meant for our own service around needing to pivot to something that was more adaptable and flexible and was able to meet the needs of the organization. And I'll do that by talking about one of our products, which was a household relief product. We'll then pause for some questions and answers, and I hope that you will be taking down some questions you'd like to ask. Of course, you can do that through the chat. Gendry is keeping an eye on that. In addition to that, if you have any insights from your own organization or country that you'd like to share, we would love to hear them. And then Susan Murray, who's soon to be Dr. Susan Murray, will come in, and she'll finish with an overview of gender and policy implications in terms of what this means moving forward. So COVID-19 Australia, every country, of course, has been impacted, but to varying degrees. As some of you would be aware, cases in Australia have been lower compared to some other comparable countries. We've had approximately 29,130 COVID-19 cases and 909 deaths. What this has meant to us over the course of a period of time, from March of last year until this period of time, has been a sequence of government and state and federal government supports, reactions, and this has taken the place of targeted support, such as something called JobKeeper and Job Seeker, which are both policy supports, which we'll talk about a bit later, as well as what's happened in terms of the closed borders. There's been state closed borders, as well as international closed borders, targeted lockdown measures, which have come into effect periodically. Some states have had different lockdown measures than other states, and general public health protocols, such as wearing masks. These have helped to keep our numbers low, but they have also presented some economic repercussions, which will come into the discussion that we talk now about in terms of its impact on working Australians. So what I'd like to do first is start out with the study that we did at the population-based level of what we termed the new vulnerable. This was conducted by Roy Morgan, which is a market research company here in Australia. The methodology used was a use of what they call their single source panel. There are 2,000 interviews that are conducted weekly through telephone and online interviews. And these are asked of all Australians. During the course of time that we studied, so April to September 2021, the number of individuals involved in this particular study were approximately 19,000 individuals. Weighting is done by Roy Morgan according to gender, age, and geography to match the Australian population to give more rigor to the data that you'll see here shortly. What we were interested in was not just the impact across all Australians, it was actually looking at a very particular group, which is working Australians. And for working Australians, we used this question as a way to screen those who had an impact as a result of COVID. Some of these impacts are positive and some of these impacts are negative, but they're all around the working arrangements that people experienced who were working Australians. What this means is that we didn't follow the same group of people over a period of time. At each of that point of the 2,000 interviews, individuals who participated were working and individuals who participated also had a negative impact. Once they came out of the workplace, we were no longer following them. So it's important to bear that in mind in terms of understanding the sort of data that we're having. It was always about working Australians and working Australians that had experienced this impact to their economic functioning. So our key finding overall is that a very large proportion of working Australians were impacted by negative changes in their employment conditions, 41%. And this is based on, if you think about this in terms of the population number of working Australians, there's approximately 5 million Australians that are in the workforce. So 41% of those experienced negative changes to their employment conditions. We divided this group into two groups. So one group we called the higher income group, and the other group we called the lower income group. And we used the distribution into those two groups according to the way in which we offer our services at Good Shepherd, rather than according to an ABS definition, so a census definition of what is higher and what is lower. So be aware that this is research grouping rather than something that would match a population census-based grouping. So in our new vulnerable lower segment, if you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see here under definitions that the lower income group referred to a couple with or without children and an annual household income of less than 100,000 Australian dollars, or single without children and an annual personal income of less than 60,000 Australian US dollars. And as you can see then, the higher income group would be the opposite of that. It would be greater than for the 100,000 or greater than 60,000. So when you're looking at this differential between the higher and the lower income, this is the way that that was divided. So we understand that there are actually people that are on average income, as we would consider in Australia, that are in that lower income category. So when we're talking lower income, it includes both those that we would traditionally consider to be lower income, as well as those that are on more average income in Australia. And for the higher income group, of course, there's a larger number that go into the higher categories that are above what we look at here, but that are part of that higher income category. So with that in mind, if you look at this chart here, you'll see how this works out in terms of the number that are in the higher income group and the number that are in the lower income group. We see there the higher income group at 58%, the lower income group at 42%. If we look then at trying to understand what that meant in terms of being vulnerable, you start to see the numbers that come through. So new vulnerable and higher income segment was 17.6%, and new vulnerable and lower income segment was 23.4%. And you can see there how that works in terms of the millions that are in the workforce. So approximately 3 million Australians are in that new vulnerable and lower income category, and approximately 2 million Australians are in that new vulnerable and higher income category. What that tells us initially is you can see, first of all, across the board, 41% experienced negative impact, and breaking it into higher and lower, you see there that there was more in that lower category of the impact at 23.4%. So if we look at this in terms of the types of impact, so we ask ourselves, you know, is it that they were laid off work? Do they have hours reduced? What happened to them? So again, going back to that earlier screen that I showed you that had the categories that we used to classify what was negative impact, you can see here the distribution for lower income, which is the gray, and higher income, which is the blue. So what we see here is 29.4% who are in the lower income group had their work hours reduced, while 15.8% who were in the higher income group had their work hours reduced. If you look then at the next category, my business has slowed or stopped completely, we see that there's less of a differential, 19.1% in the lower income and 14.5% in that higher income group. Now, if you look at this one next, stood down and not offered any work to you, you can start to see again a wider gap between the lower income and the higher income group. So had been stood down for a period of time at 17.3% for the lower income group and 6.1% for the higher income group. again, not had any work offered to you, at 15.7% for the lower income group, and 4.6% for the higher income group. So what does this tell us? This tells us that those who are in that lower income group were more likely to have their work hours reduced, to have been stood down, and to have no work offers, which tells us something about their nature of being in precarious work and the very derogatory impacts of COVID on their lifestyle and on their ability to function as working Australians. What's interesting also is if you look at the ones that come next, you can start to see some of those positive impacts. As I said to you before, there were positive impacts that were looked at as well. So now working from home, it's interesting to us. We have 15.9% of those in the lower income group compared to 37.3% in the higher income group. So this tells us something about the fact that those who were in the higher income group were more likely to be perhaps able to work from home than those who were in the lower income group, who were more likely to have work hours reduced, and very negative impacts on their ability to be employed and therefore to support themselves and their families and children. What I want to do now is move a little bit into understanding what that means for the profile. So we've looked at the types of impact, we've looked at the amount in terms of the percentages, and now we want to look at the profile and understand a bit more about, well, what is the profile of this new vulnerable group? And here we look at it according to gender, male and female, and we can see here that 40.7% of men had negative changes to their employment, compared to 41.3% of women who had negative changes to their employment. What's interesting is that when you crunch the data, there is some variability month to month. And also we feel that this picture does not fully capture the impacts for women. And so Susan will be spending quite a bit of time in the next part of the presentation talking to those gendered impacts. Age is a big feature here for us in Australia, and younger Australians bore the brunt of this. You can see here, those that were between the ages of 14 and 17% were 64.1%. Those were negatively impacted. 18 to 24-year-olds, 58%. Those are huge numbers of people who were starting out, who were trying to make their way in the world, who now have been negatively impacted in terms of their work by COVID. What's interesting to us is if you look across the other age categories here, so 25 to 34, 35 to 49, and 50 to 64, there's some comparability in those figures. But then when you look at the other category, which is at the end of 65 plus years, you'll see that 43.8% of those had a negative impact on their employment. So very much the younger cohort impacted, but also there is the older cohort impacted here as well. If we move then to the geography of impact, we have more detailed study that looked at this according to states. But what I wanted to do for us today is just look at this in terms of capital cities. So those, for example, would be Melbourne, Sydney, etc., or country areas. So those are the areas that don't include the major cities in Australia. And here you can see there is a geographical impact. So capital cities, 43% in the new vulnerable group, and in country areas that fell to 36.5%. As I said to you before, it's important to note the variability in some of this. And if I was to present this to you according to each state, you would see different impacts in each state. And that makes sense to us because we know that each state government had different responses. And we also know that the lockdowns were different in each of those states. So there is some geographical variance that is explained by that. And also you'll see that the country areas appear to be going down in terms of impact as time has gone by, while capital cities appear to be trending up. Now, bear in mind, this data is only until September 2020. So if we were to continue this study, we would see some additional trend lines moving around. If we look then at the overall study, of course, there is richness in the study, and I could have given you many more slides, but I just want to summarize now with some key findings that came out of that Roy Morgan study that tell us a bit more about the profile of those segments that I talked about. So if you look at the left, the new vulnerable segment, which again, as I explained before, is that 41% that includes both the higher income as well as the lower income segment. And you can see here a profile that comes through the data. The gender profile is not clear. There is an age profile, as I mentioned before, so you're more likely to be between 14 and 24. In terms of your family status, you're more likely not to have children aged under 18, which of course makes sense if you look at the age category. The states here are New South Wales, Sydney, and Victoria, Melbourne. And here, where you see in brackets the capital city, the emphasis here is on the impact that occurred in that capital city. So here, Sydney and Melbourne impacted. Years in Australia. One of the really interesting findings that we also had from this study was that you were more likely to be impacted. It didn't matter whether you were in the new vulnerable segment, the new vulnerable higher, or the new vulnerable lower, but you were more likely to be negatively impacted if you were not born in Australia and depending upon your years of being in Australia. So again, about one's connection with the workforce comes into play here. So the new vulnerable, non-Australians born here lived in Australia for between 0 to 10 years were those that were classified under that new vulnerable segment. Another thing that we looked at was the scale of business. So we looked at this according to whether businesses were sole traders, so one person ran the business, or whether the business had a number of employees. And here we found impact that related to the size of the business. So here the new vulnerable segment is likely to be more impacted if you were a smaller business. So a business with less than 10 people. We also looked at occupation, and here you'll see quite a range of occupations: skilled workers, semi-skilled workers, farm workers, and unskilled workers. And in terms of employment type with industry, you'll see here recreation and personal, and that's things like hairdresser, massage, that sort of personal care, retail, transport and storage, wholesale, property and business service industries. And again, if I was to look at this according to states, you would see some difference with states, but certainly you also would see the recreation, personal, and the retail coming through as significant across all states. If you look at the next category, this is the new vulnerable and the higher income segment. Here, the profile was more male. And interestingly enough, the age here is more along that middle period. So ages 35 to 64. You are more likely to be parents with children under the age of 18. And again, these are the areas where that would more likely to happen. And you'll see here, again, the importance of the capital cities, but also Northern Territory comes in here. Again, non-Australian born here. Interestingly for us, sole traders were more likely to be in this group. So when we look at the negative impact for higher income, you were more likely to have that negative impact if you were a sole trader. And I'll talk more about that because that was one of the rationales for some of the work that we've done within our organization to make sure that sole traders are supported. You'll also see there that you were in the professional managers or skilled workers categories, and the areas impacted in terms of industry were recreational and personal, wholesale, transport, and storage industries. And that, of course, makes sense if you think about the industries that were impacted the most as part of COVID. And finally, if you look at that lower income group, here you're more likely to be female. Here you're more likely to be aged between 14 and 24 or 65 plus. And we already have concern about women aging into poverty. So it's quite interesting to us that this negative impact on working Australians comes into play for that 65 plus in the area of female employment. Here also, not with children aged under 18. So that's similar to the new vulnerable segment overall. It was less likely to be a capital city issue. So here it was more the states, Victoria and Tasmania, particularly influenced here in terms of negative impact. The non-Australian born also coming into play, but here it was less than 5 years. So you were more likely to have been in Australia for less than 5 years and to have a negative impact in this particular profile. Businesses with less than 10 people were more likely to be impacted, and semi-skilled workers, farm workers, and unskilled workers. And here, the two industries that we really call out are recreational and personal and retail industries. So there's quite a lot of data there. It's a very rich study, and I'm happy to take some more questions on it after. And I could spend the entire time talking about this study, but it tells us something about this new vulnerable group that's emerging. It tells us about some of the issues that they may be facing in terms of their kind of employment. It tells us something about the precarious nature of their work, and it tells us how the real experience of COVID made an impact on certain ages, and the fact that you had been newly arrived in Australia, and the fact that the business size comes into play as being a part of this. So what I want to do now is move into a different study. So bearing in mind that we understood now a bit more at the population-wide level of the new vulnerable cohort, as I've just described to you, we wanted to understand a bit more about, well, what did those who were newly vulnerable do? What were their needs and how did they seek support? So we commissioned another study, again from Roy Morgan. And this study, which involved 822 individuals across Australia, undertaken in February and in March of 2021, sought to understand a bit more about needs and a bit more about service navigation, as we term it here in Good Shepherd. In order for individuals to participate in the study, they had to have had a negative impact as a result of their employment. So we know that everybody who was a part of the study had had a negative impact on their employment. Now, this is really interesting to us. So only 18% of those who took part in the study had a history of financial hardship prior to the pandemic. So intuitively, we felt that the group we were looking at were new to the service system and were new to financial hardship. But this statistic really tells us the extent of that. So 18% had a history of financial hardship prior to the pandemic. The other thing that this study told us is that individuals who did have that negative impact in terms of financial hardship are having ongoing impact. So here, 42% of those, and again, as I said to you before, the study was conducted in February and March of 2021, so a year beyond the initial impact. They're telling us that they're still having an ongoing impact. So 42% reported that they had a negative impact that was ongoing. So that tells us about how do we reach out to individuals to support them. We know that now this is evidence that they are indeed new vulnerable, and we know that their impact is ongoing. So we asked questions in terms of what did they do to address their personal or their financial difficulty during the pandemic. And here you can see 78% of the study took action, which is really positive. So the types of action, though, is quite interesting. And Susan will talk a bit more about the government supports, but you can see there are two government supports. One is JobKeeper and the other is Job Seeker. Now, these were federal government supports, high numbers, 44% for JobKeeper and 28% for Job Seeker. What does that tell us? It tells us the importance of that federal level support to ensure that individuals were able to have some sort of money coming through during this particularly difficult period. Another thing that you'll see here, again supported by the federal government, was the opportunity to take out your superannuation. So this is your retirement savings. In Australia, it's called superannuation. And here, 24% were able to access that money early. Asked for help from family and friends at 18%, and stopped or reduced mortgage payments at 10%. So in Australia, as I'm sure has happened in many countries around the world, banks, utilities, various other corporate organizations have made the decision to be more supportive of hardship customers. And so one of the supports that came into Australia was the opportunity to have stopped or reduced mortgage payments. And here you see that coming in at 10%. Now, when we asked them about the areas where they would need help or advice, this is what they told us: mental health at 26%. And of those who said mental health, 22% got help and 4% did not. Employment issues at 19%, 14% got help. Access to money and grants at 18% and 13% got help. Housing at 13% and 9% got help. And education or training, you can see there, 11% got help. So that's quite interesting to us in terms of the types of supports that people needed, as well as the specific actions that people took. We also wanted to understand a little bit more about what would have been helpful if they were able to access it. And interestingly enough, we see here mental health support at 41%. Now, this correlates with the earlier slide where you saw mental health is one of the things that people sought support for. So this is clear evidence of the real strong need for mental health support that has come out of COVID. Another one that was interesting for us was knowing where to get information or help. Now, this is very much around service system navigation. So again, if we look at that earlier statistic about people who were new to the financial hardship category, we understand that those individuals may have never had to go and seek support in the past. And so really knowing where to go to get help in terms of information was very important to them at 36%. That says something about how not-for-profits such as us can really step forward to help with that service navigation. If you look underneath that, having a conversation about managing finances at 26%. So about 10% less than knowing where to go for information or help. If we then look at the other categories, we see a conversation about family relationships at 24% and advice on small business support at 20%. Now, this should not be surprising to us because remember when we looked at that higher income category of those that were negatively impacted, we saw sole traders coming through there. And so this advice on small business support has been a particularly important thing for many of our new vulnerable cohort. And finally, accessing emergency relief at 15%. So this is just that basic need of groceries, the things that we need to get us through at 15%. So the other thing that we wanted to know as part of this was how many individuals in that sample of 822 individuals sought support and sought help from a community service such as ours. And we have very low numbers that sought support from a community service. That's 8% of the total. And if you look there at the types of supports that they sought help for, mental health comes up, employment issues, access to money and grants, and managing personal finances, housing, relationship counseling, domestic and family violence, education or training. So that's a cluster that comes in, each of those individual, but they're all at that 1% mark. So you see there, 8%, that's 59 individuals out of that sample of 822 sought support. So here, rounding it down, it's 7%. So here we end up looking at the various ones that come through in terms of the agencies that they've gone to. That will mean something for those of us here in Australia. What's interesting is that 2 of those organizations are actually mental health organizations, so Lifeline and Headspace. If we look at the next bullet point, you'll see there what those 59 participants sought support for. And here, counseling for mental health issues at 42%. So we've seen this now, slide after slide after slide, mental health issues coming through. Counseling or advice for something else at 34%. Information, again, this is issue about service navigation at 33%. Referral, again, supporting that at 25%. And non-monetary assistance for things such as groceries or furniture at 22%. And happily, 79% of those individuals were satisfied or very satisfied with assistance that they received. So we know that in this group, there were individuals who were able to handle their needs, and that's fine. But we do know that there were also individuals who had needs, and we wanted to know what happened there. So here we had 336 individuals who said that they had needs, but did not seek help from a community service organization. And of those, 77% found help elsewhere. 51% were unaware of what the community services sector provides, which tells us something about the way in which we need to increase our communication about what we offer. 38% did not know how to find an appropriate community service. Again, back to the service navigation issues. 25% would feel a sense of shame at approaching a community service. And we hear this in our calls where we're talking to people about when they've come to us, and many of them will talk about feeling a sense of shame, but really having nowhere else to go. And this comes through in our data here. And interestingly enough, we had the statement, community services don't help people like us at 23%. We've been digging a little bit more in the qualitative piece of this research. So it was a multi-method study. So there's a quantitative study, which I've gone through right now, but we also did a qualitative piece of work with Roy Morgan, which included 20 interviews. And that piece of work is still ongoing, so I'm unable to present it today. But what's interesting that's coming through in that qualitative study is that individuals are saying it's not so much that it's not for people like us, it's more that there are people out there who have greater need than us. And therefore, we didn't want to go and approach you because we thought there were other people that needed your services more. So that's quite interesting. And we'll be able to say a bit more about that when the final report is released. So to conclude, what did the study tell us about emerging needs and preferences? So we're seeing firsthand the wide-ranging and damaging impacts of the pandemic on the financial well-being of individuals and families. And we're seeing here that this is affecting people who have not had that experience previously of financial hardship, and it is ongoing. The new vulnerable cohort is seeking support from government and community services for the first time. And aside from mental health support, the second most important thing that people identified that would be helpful was knowing where to go to get information or help. That's something that we can definitely do more on. 42% of people who experienced a negative impact on employment during the pandemic said the impact was ongoing, as I said previously. So we know that there's more work to be done. And many people who needed support but are not accessing it, primarily because they weren't aware of what community services provide, they don't know how to find an appropriate community service, and they would feel a sense of shame. So I want to conclude with a final piece of work, which is really about how does an organization such as Good Shepherd then come into play, thinking through how do we pivot? How do we become more adaptable and flexible? What needs to happen in terms of the way in which we're supporting the new vulnerable? So first of all, this new vulnerable is actually new to us. So new vulnerable equals new needs. And here, these are some quotes from individuals who I've spoken to who've said a little bit about what brought them into our service. So here, I was behind on my electricity bill. I put it on hold because of COVID for 3 months, and then it was reinstated. So I had to pay on top of my current expenses. Another individual, I thought I was going to lose my house. I was falling more and more behind on everything. I have never been late before in my life. The stress I was under was leading me to a mental breakdown. And finally, another, I couldn't get in front of my finances. I had no work and I just got behind. And one of the things that I found in my conversations with individuals as they've explained their situation is that for many people, particularly those that are in that sole trader category, they went from, having work booked for a year to nothing in a day. So, the impact of this was for some extraordinarily quick, which meant that they didn't have a savings buffer. They didn't have any of those things which they would be able to fall back on if there was some idea of what was to come. So in terms of a case study, I've given you a case study here of someone who's accessed our services for the first time. This is an individual. This is a group. So James and Steph, a couple. They both lost their jobs in April. And one of the things that's come through in our study is that it's not uncommon for both individuals to be impacted. The full effect of lockdown orders came into effect. They are parents. James worked as a motor mechanic and was a long-term employee at a repair service that had to shut down, and so therefore he was let go. Steph worked as a property manager at a real estate agency, which also closed its door. James and Steph had applied for the job seeker payment. So again, that's something that Susan will talk about momentarily, but that's a payment that comes through Centrelink. And it took a period of time for individuals to access that. So here, 4 to 6 weeks. So they're facing into a period of time where they have nothing, 4 to 6 weeks of waiting for something to come through. And they're really concerned about their housing, they're concerned about their mortgage, and they're unaware of the community support services that are available to help them in that situation. So that's one of our studies that comes through from our service of a couple that came to us for the first time. So in terms of our response, so as I said to you at the beginning, Good Shepherd Australia and New Zealand offers microfinance. So microfinance in the context of other countries is often around micro enterprise. So the way in which finance is used to help build up small business. In the Australian context, it's been different. In the Australian context, it's about asset building, and really it's been around asset building for white goods. So Good Shepherd, I'm sure those of you who are part of Good Shepherd will know about our NILS product. So NILS is a no interest loan scheme. And this scheme allows individuals to have a loan, again, no interest, and it allows them to purchase things that they need. It could be a fridge, it could be a couch, It could be technology, so a computer for their child so that the child has a computer at school. It could be specific to school needs like uniform, also for medical expenses, et cetera. So it's been very much focused on building up the assets of individuals who have needs, and it's been run quite successfully for many years now. But traditionally, rent and utilities were excluded from this loan purpose because it wasn't about, obviously, rent and utilities won't do anything in terms of building asset. For us, our typical client group were individuals who were low income. So when we talked earlier about that categorization here, we're looking at 45K for single or 60K for families. Generally, individuals are on a government benefit of some sort, pension card or healthcare card. And we also see people who come through who are carers or who are family violence supporters. And we have a special product that is for individuals who have experienced family and domestic violence. The loan amount is up to 2K, and the repayment period is over 12 to 18 months. So this was our product that we had that pre-existed COVID. And the conversation with the government then became, what sort of product is needed now? How do we take the systems and the structures and the way in which we are able to process loans here at Good Shepherd and change that into something that is more supportive of individuals who have been impacted by COVID? And we ended up with something called household relief with the financial conversation. So the financial conversation is now a key part of our service delivery. So when an individual calls up, they're taken through a conversation around what's going on for them. So a bit of a needs assessment. They're taken through a conversation to try to understand a bit more about what their needs may be around referral, or what their needs may be around some of the other things that they may be facing, not just the need for a loan, but some of these other things. And we found that there's quite a number of people that have come through that haven't actually needed the household relief loan. And they just needed information, advice, referral, and we've been able to provide that. Others that needed the household relief loan, they were able to qualify for what we have, which allows for loan purpose to be used for rent and utilities. So to get somebody over that period of time where they don't have that rent and they're not able to pay their utilities, but they're being chased. So this loan is available for that. And here you'll see a bit more in terms of the cohort. The cohort is different. So the cohort here is a slightly higher income cohort, which makes sense if you think about this in terms of what we described earlier about the population level data in terms of both a lower income cohort and a higher income cohort that have been impacted by COVID. The loan amount is slightly more, and the repayment period is between 12 and 24 months. So I want to say a little bit about this product itself in terms of what it's meant for us. And here we're really finding, and I've done an evaluation of the initial few months of household relief, and we're finding that it is really proving its success. I can't tell you the number of times individuals have expressed to me how much this helped them, not just in terms of their financial well-being, but their mental well-being, taking away that stress and anxiety around money. What are we going to do next? And so at the individual level, if you look at the left, these are some of the things that people have talked about. So confidence, increase in capability, increase in connection. At that systems level, this is quite fundamental to how we're shifting the way in which we're delivering services. And here, we're offering a holistic and a human-centered service response. It's multidisciplinary, which means that we're able to refer into other services, both internally and externally. So for example, if an individual comes to us and they're in need of financial counseling, we can give that referral. If an individual comes to us and they're in need of family and domestic violence support, we're able to give that support. Or if they're in need of finding out about some emergency relief that's close to where they live, we're able to offer that referral. So this has been an important way in which we've been able to do a wraparound service for those particular individuals. Capability. This means that in terms of our workforce, we have a dedicated and highly skilled staff that are available for that needs assessment and those financial conversations. So these aren't just about the loan conversation, it's now about that needs assessment and financial conversation. So we need financial capability workers and people who have skills in social work to do that. Our social workers are embedded within our financial counselors. So again, that integrated service approach is important to us. And overall, overarching is a trauma-informed approach. Finally, connection. We have new intake and referral channels. We have a national contact center, and we've integrated our service delivery and referrals. And we continue to work in this space and develop new products and new systems as we move forward. So this is one example of how Good Shepherd has very much pivoted in response to the new vulnerable. I want to conclude with this final slide that brings this together. So first of all, if we look at this in terms of poverty, so as I said to you before, our higher income and our lower income categories were driven by the need we had around the research. But if we look at this according to poverty indicators, we can see that 3.24 million Australians live in poverty. Overall, Australia ranks 27th out of 38 OECD countries on social expenditure. So we knew prior to COVID, we already had some issues around poverty, but we also know that disadvantage goes beyond poverty. So for us, moving beyond just poverty stats and thinking about who we support that are under that, that are in poverty has been an important thing for us. So there are many newly vulnerable. Here, COVID-19 has led to sharp declines in paid work hours. Many have never had to access services before, and the system can be overly complex, particularly if they've never accessed services before or need a range of different supports. So that's come through, as you saw, from the various data that I've shown you today. Current welfare supports have mitigated inequality. So when we saw earlier in terms of JobKeeper and Job Seeker, both of those federal government supports have mitigated what would have been really more negative financial impacts. And as I said to you before, Susan will talk a bit more about that. But we do know that as time has gone by and governments are making decisions that now they need to think about the economic bottom line, we know that some of those supports are falling away. And we're quite concerned about what happens when those supports fall away, because we know that there is the continued impact which shows up in our data. And finally, welfare costs will create costs elsewhere. So we know that disadvantage costs the government in terms of productivity, participation, employment, consumption, health and justice, crime, family breakdown, and other social costs. And the community sector and the support for the community sector has been significant in terms of helping to offset costs for government. And we've done some work in terms of putting a money value on that, which I'm not going to bring to our attention today because it's still commercial in confidence. But we have been working with government to say, okay, you know, what is the value of these services that we hold? What is the gain that you get from these services? But in addition to that, Susan will talk about a very interesting study that looked at what happened to individuals when they did have additional amounts of money, when they were given some additional supplement, and what they did in terms of their time use, which tells us something about how when you support people financially, they actually make improvements across a full range of their life opportunities. So that's all I had for us today. I'll close there. Thank you very much for your attention and your time. It was a bit of data to throw at you. So of course, the report itself is available. Gendry can talk about that in a little bit. So if you're interested in reading the report, some of those statistics are in the report itself. So thank you very much. Over to you, Gendry.
Thanks, Zara. Wow, well, that was quite a comprehensive and deep look at some of the things that we've discovered about people in Australia. Now, as you were listening to all of that, you might have thought to yourself, well, we did have some things that were very similar to that. We did find some of the people who before were coping quite well suddenly weren't, and things like that. So that new vulnerable group, ask yourself the question, did you find that group in your community or local area? And the other thing that's coming out quite strongly is that young girls and older women are on the spectrum the most disadvantaged, if you could summarize it that way, in Australia. And that information helps us to think about, well, what's the direction of our programs into the future? So all these stats that Zara has collated and looked at is really, the idea of it is, what does it mean for us as Good Shepherd? Where should our resources and our time be spent? I thought the quotes were quite powerful because they were mostly from people who either didn't know where to go because they'd never been in trouble before, they felt ashamed because they hadn't been in the situation before. And I think this whole group of new people, it's kind of really informing Good Shepherd in terms of where we need to be. But as you listened, you might have thought, yes, there were a lot of quotes there and a lot of stories about hardship and a lot of statistics, but there was also, on the other hand, lots of opportunities that we don't have where we are. So I just want to pause for a moment and invite those of you whose names I can see, if you're still with us, if you want to just pop your videos back on again, if you're still there and close by. I wouldn't mind hearing from you what you thought maybe was similar or different from what Zara was talking about where you are. Mary-Jean, you're with us. Have you as a group reflected on the impact of COVID on the people that you work with?
I'm working alone.
Yeah. Yes. Have you noticed
Yes. Especially in my community, there are 4 other sisters. They're working different places. The ministry are very much impacted by the COVID-19. Because of the, for example, hotline, they cannot go to home visit. Usually, kind of a domestic violence emergency when they ask to come visit. But nowadays, because of the COVID situation, they're harder to visit. So these are all change the situation.
And that would make those people be more vulnerable, Mary-Jean?
Yes, of course, especially women, domestic women who are battered wives, women who are, the having a domestic violence is more vulnerable.
Yes. What about the employment situation, Mary-Jean? Do you find that many businesses have closed?
Yes. For example, we are not allowed to go to a restaurant. Even one family, the number of less 5 members. Otherwise, we cannot go into the restaurant. So only, even though our family members has to be separated. When we go, go to the restaurant, we have to be separately room. Have to order separately room. So many restaurants and many business shops are shut down because of the COVID-19 situation.
And Mary-Jean, would they be owned largely by a family? Like the family would own the restaurant and all the family members might work there, and the same with other business, that the family is involved?
Yeah, it depends on, because small restaurant also very much. But Zara, when I heard Zara's presentation, I think the poor people are more, small business are more affected by the COVID-19.
Yes,
so
that's
I
true.
can very easily see that our neighbors' restaurants and business shops are, not like alive like before. So it's very much affected.
Yes. What about, Sash, you were there. Were you going to say something, Sash?
Back here in India, even otherwise, it has been a very difficult struggle at the economic front for women. I would particularly stress on women because just coping in the industry and surviving has been a challenge. And the last 1 year, many businesses have just collapsed and shut down. Interestingly, the ones who bounced back are the ones who could work out from their homes. So, small kitchens and community kitchens which emerged from their homes and started advertising and supplying using the local WhatsApp and, such communication tools, as well as even taking the food and on a cart and selling it, or on a tricycle and going out of the homes and selling it. That was a very interesting business which has emerged in the last 1 year. And I think this is the survival instinct of the women who have to fend for large families, and their cooking is their, and catering is their natural strengths. So there have been people who are government school teachers and people employed in different sectors who lost their jobs, who simply resorted to this method. That's something which I would like to sound.
That's interesting, Sashi, because we also found that people that were employed in different areas had to move completely outside their area. It wasn't cooking, but for example, because the airlines were closed, our pilots ended up driving the school bus you know, there were lots of people had to be adaptable. Yeah, absolutely. Tracy or Josie, would you have anything you would like to contribute to our chat? You're on mute, Josie. Sorry. What?
Thanks, Zara, for your presentation. Thanks, Gendry. Listening to your presentation, Zara, I think the COVID pandemic really affected across Asia Pacific, including Sabah, my place. I agreed with the point that Mary Jean has mentioned, that in our place as well, there are a lot of businesses being affected, and family as well. There were increase of family violence, unemployment, and even in the rural areas, women who used to go to their field are not allowed because it's a very strict movement control during that time. Yeah, so this is how this pandemic affects our women and their families.
Josie, do you have any insight into how that affected them from a mental health, or just how they survived in their own emotions, that kind of thing? Do you have any insight into that?
During the pandemic, yes, we reached out to the students around our area, and we discovered that a lot of them experience mental health issue. Yeah, and they have no way to express their anxieties. Because some of them, you know, they are being trapped in their hostel and they are not with their family members. So this is where our services, the Youth Prep Center, have extended our help. Besides listening to their emotional needs, we too help them in terms of food, just to ease them of their anxiety.
Yeah. Thank you, Josie. It just seems that there are similar sorts of, different cultural sides to it, but similar issues arising. But there's a big gap, isn't there, in what can be provided? Like Australia was very lucky that the government was able to provide some of these unemployment, JobKeeper and JobSeeker funds. But I'm sure that I know from speaking to people that didn't happen across the Malaysia or Asia Pacific either. So there's a big gap, isn't there, in what's provided on the financial side from different governments and things. Yeah. Look,
Andrew, I would just say quickly too that, you know, where we've been trying to build up women's economic participation through small business, which I know is the future of the work we do in Asia, you know, that hasn't been possible, right? So, you know, the opportunity to pivot, which is what we're talking about in terms of changing your business to something else. But for many people, you know, women lost that economic resource, right?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Zara. Is there any final? Hello, Sister Teresa Song. Hello. Welcome to the group. How about if there's no further comment, we can come back to some of this, but what about if we have a listen now to Susan Murray, who's our next speaker. And Susan is our Research and Evaluation Officer at Good Shepherd Australia, New Zealand, and she's going to just do a little bit more of a closer look about the impact, that what we call the gender impact, but it's about, you know, I'm thinking and imagining that Susan's going to speak about the impact on women and girls. So Susan, I'm going to hand over to you for your session now.
All right, thanks, Gendry, and hello, everybody. It's really nice to see you all after so many years of being with Good Shepherd. It's nice to see people from other countries, which doesn't happen very often. I hope you can see my screen all right.
Do you want to enlarge it, Susan, to the big?
Yes, I do. Hang on.
Just on the right, yeah, just if you can put it on a slideshow maybe.
This thing is in my way, it's a problem.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, there we go. There, okay. Okay, does that look all right?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to be talking about women, poverty, and COVID-19, the Australian experiences. So Zara's talk set us up really nicely for that, looking at the population-wide issues. Now we're going to dig a little bit deeper into what this pandemic has meant for women in particular in Australia. Go. There we go. All right, we'll get there. I would like to start by acknowledging country. We acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we are living and working. And for us, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging. And we acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how poverty is gendered in Australia, and I know that all of you experience that in your countries of work and living as well. I'm going to look at 4 primary areas, and that's employment, caring work, the welfare system, which we've touched on a little bit, and family violence. So first, an overview. Zara touched on this already a little bit. Our case load has been fairly low in Australia. However, the impacts, most of the impacts that we're seeing are policy impacts. So that's what I'm going to be talking about in this session, is how the policy choices that the government has made has impacted on women and how that may be different to how it's impacted on men. So poverty is gendered in Australia. Women are more likely to live in poverty, and this is in part due to near universal experiences that women have, and this includes the gender pay gap, caring and household responsibilities, which of course is unpaid, and then overlaid identities or experiences, and that can include experiences of domestic violence, single parenting, well, most of which are women, and other overlapping identities that further remove women from decision making. So looking at some of these bigger issues, 34% of Australian women have experienced domestic or sexual violence, and this has tripled the rate for men, and we will talk about that a little bit more towards the end of the presentation. Of single parents, 82% of them are women, and households headed by single mothers are the poorest household type in Australia. And then if we think about overlaying identities, women with disabilities, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, recently arrived women, older women, and women with compromised physical or mental health are further sidelined from economic security and financial inclusion. And in Zara's presentation, some of those themes have already come up. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about employment, and I've organized this to show you what things were like for women prior to COVID, and then I will be showing you what the impacts of COVID have been, because I wanted to show you how women were already at a disadvantage, and then COVID came in and kind of, well, exacerbated the problems that are there. So these first few slides are talking about how things were prior to COVID. So prior to COVID, we have a gender pay gap. And if you look at the box on the left, it shows that women in Australia are actually much better educated than men. So 92.5% of women between the ages of 20 and 24 have a year 12 qualification, compared to 87.5% of men. So that's finishing high school. 48.3% have a bachelor degree or above, and that compares to 36.1% for men. And of all university student enrollments, 58.5% are female. And this continues to increase year on year. There's more women and fewer men enrolled in university. However, despite women being so well educated here, we do have a gender pay gap, and that is on the right. So it's 13.4% for full-time employees across all industries. So that's an average. So women take home an average of $1,558 per week, and men take home an average of $1,812 per week. So accumulating that across a year, that's a gap of $13,000, which is quite a bit. That also means that there's a gendered superannuation gap. And superannuation is the government mandated retirement scheme. And basically that comes out of your paid wages. So if you're not getting paid as much as someone else, then there's less going into your retirement funds. So we also have a gap of 34% for retirement. Now there's also a gender pay gap by industry. And I wanted to show you this slide because we'll come back to looking at industry impacts on COVID-19 in a few minutes. So if you look at the slide on the left, these are the industries that most women work in. And I know it's not terribly clear, but that biggest one there is healthcare and social assistance at 23%. And this is quite normal across the globe, actually. And so one of the impacts of COVID has been that women are more exposed to it because there's more women in healthcare. 13% are in education and training, 12% in retail trade, 8% in accommodation and food services, and 8% in professional, scientific, and technical services. The graph on the right shows the industries that most men work in. So 15% are in construction, 9% in professional, scientific, and technical services. So a bit of overlap there. 9% in manufacturing, 8% in retail trade, and 8% in transport, postal, and warehousing. Now, if you look at female-dominated industries, which is the one on the top, the average woman in a female-dominated industry is $99,324, but the male remuneration is $113,633. So that's a gender gap of 13.5%. In mixed industries, which is that middle line, the average female remuneration is lower at $91,999. Male remuneration is higher at $122,840. And the gap there is 30%, which is massive. And then in male-dominated industries, female remuneration is kind of in the middle there. It's $94,760. For men, it's $120,477. And that's still quite a big gap, it's 24%. So depending on the industry, the gender gap changes. Now, if we look at the impacts of COVID, one of the interesting things that came out of our Roy Morgan data, and this is something that Zara didn't share, but it's from them, is what industries were most impacted. So what we found when we mapped their findings using a gendered lens was that female-dominated industries were hardest hit by the pandemic and the attendant economic shocks. So the female-dominated industries on here are colored in red, and those are retail, community services, and recreation and personal. And you can see that they are almost the most hardest hit. The male-dominated industries are in purple, and you can see that their impacts, while significant, were much less. And then we have the mixed industries, and the one on the far right is the only one that really sticks up, and that's because it's labeled other. So Roy Morgan didn't disaggregate that for us. It would be interesting to know what's in that third category. But you can see from there that it's the female-dominated industries who have the biggest impacts. Oops, sorry. Did we lose that? Okay, where do we go? Okay, there we go. Okay, so employment and COVID-19, this is analysis I did just on ABS data. So that's the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and they have many publicly available data sets, and this is one of them. So we looked at who was not in the labor force at selected time points. So females are the red bar again. And if you look in September, prior to COVID-19, those two bars on the left, male and female, more women were not in the labor force than men. And then if you look at April, right when things were hitting hard, both go up, but women goes up quite a bit further. And then those third two bars are data from January. So I've just updated those. And men have almost recovered. They had a little blip and they've come back down, but women are still pretty high. So we saw many more women than men move out of the labor force in 2020. And it appears that men are returning and women perhaps not. And then underemployment. This is an interesting graph. So the ABS has a category in which they talk about people who want more hours but can't get them. And this is a specific category that they tracked for, or they reported on for COVID, which is people working less hours for economic reasons. That is, there just wasn't work available. So at the height of the pandemic, women were more likely to have hours reduced due to being stood down or insufficient work being offered. And that's the red bar there. And you can see in April, the red bar just goes shooting up. It increased over 400%. And the purple bar is men. They also had a hard time. Theirs went up 300%, but not quite as dramatic as for women. Okay, and this is back to the Roy Morgan data again. So the Roy Morgan data showed us that women and men experience different negative impacts. So women, who are the red bars, were more likely to have reduced hours, to be stood down from their work, or not to have work offered, while men were more likely to have business slowed or stopped. And perhaps that's because they were small business owners. And then the other negative impacts were about the same for both. So that's the employment little section I wanted to share with you. And you can see that for when you slice the employment impacts a little bit closer, you can see that women were hit in different ways than men were. Okay, the second section is talking about caring work and who is doing unpaid care work. So in Australia, as around the globe, there are gendered expectations and norms about who performs caring and household work. Now, this graph that I'm showing you is a bit old. It's from 2006. And the reason why is because it comes from time use survey. So what are people doing right at this moment? They ask people and they track who's doing what at what point in time during the day. And they haven't actually conducted this survey since 2006. But thankfully, they're bringing it back. So we'll have some updated data at some point. So this is a little bit old. But you can see that unpaid care work is the yellow there. And for women, it is 64% of their time. For men, it's 36% of their time. So it's about half. And the gray is productive or paid work. So women have about 36% of their time that they spend on paid work, and men have 64% of their time spent on paid work. So basically, it's completely inverse, that women are spending much more time on unpaid duties and much less time on paid duties. And for men, it's the opposite. So this means women have fewer hours than men that they can actually work because they're trying to fit it in around all those unpaid things. So if you look at the data pre-COVID, almost 70% of part-time workers are women in Australia. 27% more women than men consider themselves underemployed. That is, they would like more hours and can't get them. And 33% more women than men are not in the labor force at all. Now, when we're talking about care work, nobody has a harder time than single mothers. And I wanted to highlight their struggles a little bit. So as mentioned already, 82% of single parents are women. And these are the poorest households in Australia. And so this is due to an overlay of difficulties in working full time when you have all those uncaring duties and actually nobody to help you. Difficulties in accessing child support, which are the laws in Australia are not very supportive for single mothers. And then finally, low welfare rates and punitive welfare policies. And I will talk more about those in just a minute. So if you look at the graph here, the light blue is, these are single parents. So the light blue graph is whether the mother is employed, and the dark blue one is whether the father is employed. And they've organized it by age of the youngest child. So if the youngest child is under the age of 4, which is on the far left, only 40%, 39% of working mothers, of single mothers are working, compared to 65% of fathers. And when their children get a little older, if they're between the ages of 5 and 9, that rises to 66% for single mothers. And that's actually higher than for fathers. And then from 10 to 14, it goes up a little bit more to 68%. And from 15 to 24, up to 76%. And then it drops down again for non-dependent child. I'm not sure why. It's 43%. It might be because those are older women. I'm not sure. There's no explanation for that. So you can see that childcare duties limit the amount of time that single mothers can spend working. So this means that for a lot of women, because of their caring duties, they require flexible employment. The problem is that flexible positions are also often precarious. So precarious employment is low paid. It has few or no benefits. It often has erratic scheduling, insecure or short-term contracts. It means holding little power in the organization and few or no opportunities for advancement. And I'm sure all of you work with women who are in precarious employment. These employment constrictions can lead to few or no worker protections, financial stress, work-family conflict, increased anxiety and depression, reduced physical health, and actually to such an extent that precarious employment can actually reduce your lifespan. Underutilizing of capabilities and creating long-term financial disadvantage. So when we overlay caring work in COVID-19, we find that men did take on more caring and household work, but women bore the brunt of it. So ABS data, again, is reported on the left. Women were 3 times as likely to be looking after children full-time on their own during the pandemic, 46% compared to 17% of men. This led to difficulties maintaining employment and contributed to poor mental health outcomes for women compared to men. And on the right is another data set that was done by Australian Institute for Family Studies. It was just a survey, but it's quite interesting. So they asked who cared for children during lockdown, and it was the mother 52% of the time. 37% of families said they equally shared, and 11% said the father was usually who cared for children. And then they also asked who did housework during the lockdown, and the mother, it was usually the mother 41% of the time. It was equally shared 48% of the time, so a little bit closer, or usually the father at 9% of the time. Okay, this is where we're going to dig into welfare policies a little bit. So I wanted to start with this slide because women do experience more poverty compared to men. So in Australia, 20% of women live in poverty, and that compares to 17% of men. Women spend more years in poverty compared to men, and poverty rates for older women are increasing dramatically. And Zara mentioned this, and it also came up in her data set. They are increasingly dependent on income support payments to make ends meet. And 57% of all people on income support are women. So the welfare policies have a disproportionate impact on women because there's more women reliant on them. So pre-COVID, the main unemployment payment, there's quite a few payments in Australia, but the main unemployment payment was called the New Start Allowance. So the graph on the left compares the New Start Allowance to pension and wages. So if you look at this blue line on the top, that's the average wage in Australia, and this dark blue line below it is the median wage. So that's around $1,500 per week. Then if you come way down here where the brown one is, that's the minimum wage, which is $694 per week. So quite a bit less. And then down here below that is the pension. So quite a bit below minimum wage at $437 per week. And then this line down at the bottom that almost looks like it's the line at the bottom of the graph, but it's not. It's the New Start Allowance, $267 per week. So it is below the pension, it's below the minimum wage, it's far below average wages. If you look at the graph on the right, this is comparing the New Start Allowance, which is this red line here, with two poverty lines. So we've got the Henderson poverty line, which I should have written this down. I believe it's 50% of the average income for a family, comparable family. And then the 50% of median poverty line, which is similar. So quite a bit below the poverty line there, pre-COVID. So one of the silver linings of COVID in Australia is that poverty decreased quite dramatically. So changes were made to the Australian Social Security system to make it less punitive and more supportive. So by punitive, I mean it was designed to make it extremely unpleasant for people to receive payments. And the idea is that it will push people off. So if you treat them badly, they will leave. They'll, hopefully be encouraged to go find paid work is the government view of it. So it became more supportive. The coronavirus supplement was introduced, and it effectively doubled the amount that people received for many payments, not all of them, but it was added to quite a few, including the New Start Allowance, which was changed. The name was changed to Job Seeker. Australia also has something called mutual obligations, where in order to receive payments, you are expected to have an obligation back to the government. And that can include attending meetings, applying for a certain number of jobs per month, volunteering. Yeah, it's all very structured. And the JobKeeper payment was provided to many companies to keep staff on during the downturn. So Zara mentioned that several people in her data had been on the JobKeeper payment. So this was a payment that companies applied for, and it was paid directly to their employees while they were shut down so that they wouldn't have to redundance them. So if you look at the graph on the right, it shows what happened with the New Start Allowance, or the Job Seeker as it's now called, down here below the poverty line and below the pension, which is this blue one. And when they introduced these payments, it went shooting up past the poverty line and the pension line, and then came back down again because they have reduced those amounts. So I wanted to show you these two graphs because I think they're quite striking. So poverty rates in Australia, on the left, during the economic downturn, poverty rates in Australia decreased 33%. And this was due to the COVID-19 supplement. And I think this may be unusual, specific to Australia. I don't think many other countries saw something like this. So yeah, if you look at pre-COVID rates on the far left, there were 1.6 million people in poverty. And in June, at the height of the COVID response, that was down to 1.1. And without those measures, the red bar is June. If they hadn't done anything, it would have gone up to almost 4 million people. So it had quite an effect. And if you look at the graphs on the right, those are poverty rates for those specific to the job seeker payment, as well as youth allowance, which is what is given to young people who are looking for work. So for people who receive job seeker or the youth allowance, poverty was reduced by 90%. So really phenomenal. Okay, so Zara mentioned that we engaged in some research to understand what this meant for people who had been on payments. What did it mean for them to have this increase in payments? And mutual obligations were also reduced. So this is a report that's forthcoming. It will be launched next week on the 25th of March. But this is a little sneak preview for you. So these are just a few of the ways that employment-related activities were influenced. So if you look at the graph on the left, we asked people how they spent their time studying over the pandemic period when they were receiving these supplements. And the purple bars are people who received the supplement, and the yellow bars are people who did not. So you can see for studying on the far left, it asks if you started or increased the amount of time you spent studying. And 33% of people who received the supplement started or increased studying during this time. And this compares to only 13% of people who did not. So quite a dramatic difference there. And in the middle bars are if there was no change, and those are roughly comparable. But to the right are those who decreased or stopped studying. And you can see people who did not receive the supplement were much more likely to stop studying at 16%, compared to only 2% who got the supplement. And then the graph on the right is time spent looking for paid work. Now, a lot of people did not look for paid work during COVID because there wasn't a lot of jobs going. We were in an economic downturn. But for people who received the supplement, 37% said they started or increased looking for work during this time. So that's really quite dramatic compared to only 13% who did not receive it. Those two bars in the middle are no change again, and they're about the same, and decreased or stopped is roughly the same as well. Then we asked a range of questions about time spent looking after physical health. And so the graph on the left asks that very specific question: how much time did you spend looking after your physical health? And again, the differences are quite dramatic. So people who received the supplement, 72% said they started or increased the amount of time spent on physical health, compared to only 19% of people who did not. And if you look to the right, the decreased or stopped, 41% of those who did not receive the supplement stopped looking after their physical health, compared to only 1% of people who did receive the supplement. So having this extra money was obviously very important to be able to look after their physical health. The graph on the right is eating well. And again, it's almost identical to looking after physical health. So 72% of people who received the supplement started or increased eating well, compared to only 20% of people who didn't. And then if you look at decreased or stopped on the right, 30% of people who did not receive the supplement decreased or stopped eating well during COVID. So huge differences there. And we asked about mental health and well-being. So on the left is a graph that asks specifically how much time did you spend supporting your mental health. And again, women, people who received the supplement, 72% started or increased the amount of time they spent supporting their mental health, compared to only 26% of people who did not. And to the right, we have recreational activity or hobby. Not quite as dramatic, but still a huge difference. So people who received the supplement, 54% started or increased spending time on a recreational activity or hobby, compared to only 21% of those who did not receive the supplement. And those who did not receive the supplement were also much more likely to have decreased or stopped spending time on a hobby at 34%. So huge differences here. So we also asked, we gave them some open-ended questions, quite a few. I'm not going to go into all that data because it would just take too long. But essentially what people told us is that they spent their money on basic needs. So there's a quote there: "I didn't have to choose between food, bills, and medication. People's mental health improved. I was able to redirect my thoughts away from constant worry to productive and creative activities and thinking. And people were more productive. I could really focus on study and make progress for the first time in a couple of years towards my goals." Now, right when we put out this survey, they had started to reduce the coronavirus supplement. So it started at $550 per fortnight, which roughly doubled payments, as I mentioned. When we launched this survey, it had been reduced from $550 to $250. So it had dropped quite a bit. And then it dropped again, and now it's almost back to its pre-COVID amounts. So we asked them how the reduction had impacted them, and it was already having an impact, and it was still quite a bit higher than it is now. So the reduction in payments have put people back in financial stress. And there's a quote there: "I'm juggling bills and putting off spending on medications or good food." And anxiety and stress increased as soon as the first reductions took place. And someone said, "I've already noticed the stress returning. Soon I will return to living below the poverty line." And productive activities were negatively impacted, that should say. "My plans for creating self-sufficiency through a home business have evaporated." Okay, so that's a little section on welfare. And I just have a very short bit on family violence. This is not my area of expertise. But as with a lot of countries, and some of you mentioned this at the end of Zara's presentation, the impacts have gone up. So pre-COVID, family violence was definitely a gendered issue in Australia, as it is globally. So Australian women are 3 times more likely to experience violence from a partner. 10 women per day are hospitalized for assault injuries perpetrated by a partner. Women experience fear and anxiety over violence perpetrated by a former partner at 2 times the rate as men. And on average, one woman per week is killed by a current or former partner. And you may have seen in the news yesterday that there was quite a few protests around Australia, more than 40, to request more government attention on this issue. People are kind of fed up about the whole thing. So what happened with COVID when it overlays with domestic violence? We saw a big increase. So 23% increase in clients overall, 53% increase in casework time. So more time was spent with each person. And that was partly because, as somebody mentioned, you couldn't go to people's homes. So casework was all done remotely, and that sometimes took more time. There was a 26% increase in brokerage payments. And those are payments that it's money that's not designated. So it can be used as a discretionary to help women however they may need help. So they may need, a new phone, or they may need petrol for their car, whatever it might be. That's brokerage money. So that increased quite a bit. 67% increase in younger women seeking support. and 68% increase in clients from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So young people and newly arrived people also were highlighted in Zara's data set. And again, we're seeing them come up as having some really negative impacts. So this is just a summary slide of some of the things that we found in Good Shepherd Australia. And we did publish this in a report that kind of tried to capture all these findings, which Gendry mentioned at the start. So overall, what we're finding, the impacts of COVID-19, it's revealed fundamental schisms in our workforce, income and welfare supports in society more generally. And I think that's true globally, that it has really exacerbated and made visible where there is already injustice and dysfunction in our systems. And that was certainly true here as well. The negative impacts have disproportionately affected women, people on low incomes, newly arrived migrants, and people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. Family and domestic violence, including economic abuse, increased during this time. COVID-19 saw more people than ever before needing support from government and community service organizations. And there was a widening of the group of people that were traditionally considered financially vulnerable. And while there was a silver lining for people on welfare payments, these increases have now been rolled back and people are really struggling. And finally, many who were impacted last year are struggling to quote unquote recover, and whether they will recover is another question. Yeah, so that's my overall presentation. I didn't really get into the government response to a lot of this, but I will mention that most of the government targeted policies for recovery are aimed at male-dominated industries. Yeah, and not targeted the way that we would advocate for. So yeah, that's it. I don't know if there's any questions or comments.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you so much, Susan. Do you want to just unshare for us? Just do that, and we'll bring people back into the room. Thank you. Thank you so much. Again, very detailed data there, but in the big picture, you know, the big learning is, as you said, Susan, that women, particularly younger and older women, have been disadvantaged in this time. And a lot of it was due to, you know, the lack of employment opportunities, and some of the people online before mentioned about having to diversify and change what they were doing to survive. And I saw a lot of people nodding when we talked about precarious employment and the impacts of that, the impacts on people for it, and how huge the load has been on mothers and single parents at home to manage. You also showed us that, you know, if there's a bit of financial stability, people actually improve in their health and well-being. And what we're seeing is that, you know, we had an insight into that. And it's a big learning that if you just add a little extra to the income that people have earned, that they will be probably better off and much healthier in the long term. But I think we have to sort of be really realistic here and say Australia in particular has a government that was willing to put money into these ventures. Now, I'd be interested to hear from others in the room, Teresa or Murray-Jean, or even Teresa, yourself there, or anyone else who's listening. You know, is this unusual? Did your governments contribute in this way to support people or not? How did it work for you? You're nodding, Murray-Jean. Did you see anything different? Did you see any input from the government or from South Korea?
Our government already 2 times, a whole people of Korean, they gave a supplement.
Yeah.
Once individually, once $200 US, and then one time is $100 US. So it's already 2 times.
Right.
Gave us a supplement.
To help people get through, huh?
It's two purpose. One purpose is to help people to overcome the situation, but
Yes.
one is to, you know, the kind of trade, you know, to using the money to moving the business.
Oh yeah, to keep the
So,
business
yes,
going.
keep
Yeah,
the
spending.
business going. Yes,
Yeah,
yes, spending
yes.
money.
To encourage people to
So
spend
even
money.
the older sisters are using this money to buy something, to
Oh.
send the, you know, family
Oh.
to buy the gifts, or, you know, to send the family like that.
Pleased to hear that they're helping. That's very good to hear.
Yeah.
Teresa Simons, what about Malaysia? What do you know? What can you share with us about how the government may have responded at all or not to some of these? I mean, I think Australia's situation is pretty rare. Do you think?
Yes, I think the Australian situation is pretty rare, and it looks like there are quite a number of social protection flaws that are already in place in Australia, which is not quite the same in, I'd rather respond for Asia Pacific,
Yes.
in the countries where Good Shepherd is present in Asia Pacific,
Yes.
especially
Yes.
countries from the South where Good Shepherd International Foundation is supporting through grants, etc.
Okay.
We find that most of the women in these countries are either informal sector workers that have really no social protection at all. They are mainly daily paid wages, or they could be doing part-time work whilst being full-time at home, you know, with the children and looking after the families. So we also find that these women are sometimes partly responsible for overall household income, but at the same time are the primary caregivers for the family. So this is where we are seeing the general population of women that we work with in Asia Pacific. Notwithstanding that, as Sashi mentioned earlier, the resilience of women in all sectors is really very commendable. How the women have also helped to sustain and prop up the families through side business, through cottage industries, through taking homework and trying to make ends meet for the families. We envisage that going forward, the situation may even be worse, because we are now only seeing the effects of closure of many commercial businesses, many restaurants that cannot survive the downturn of the economy, and eventually the women who are the informal sector workers and their families would surely be affected.
I think that's a universal experience, Teresa, that, you know, there may have been people who've adapted. Someone spoke about that. Sashi spoke about that before. They've made the adaptation, but at some point that is going to fall through as well. And I know even with all the support that people in Australia have received through these income streams, when that ends, we are actually waiting for the fall, you know, for many, many people. And many of these people, as we said before, have never sought help before. So they are a new group of people who also don't know how to find their way around the systems. They've never had to ask for this help. So likewise, I think the world is on a bit of a seesaw in a way. You know, we've sort of survived and coped and adapted. But, you know, what's going to happen over the next 6 to 12 months will be quite interesting to see.
It's interesting, Gendry, what you shared just now about people not knowing how to access their rights and the whatever that's due to them. That's also what we see in many of the places where we work. You know, even in very poor countries that have got minimal social protection flaws, women do not know how to access them. So it looks like it cuts across different socioeconomic statuses, you know, different countries. Yeah, the same situation is present.
Yeah, even though the supports might vary greatly, but the actual access. And I think this is interesting. You know, if you can access information, if you know how to do that, you know, I think it's very empowering, isn't it, to be able to do it. And I think if people can't or don't know how to, or they feel ashamed to, it is quite a challenge.
Yeah.
There are a couple of other people. Yes, Zara, sorry.
I was just going to say there's also an onus not just on the individual to find the information, but on services like ours to make it really easy, right?
Yeah. Yep. So maybe that's a learning to come out of this, this time together is, just reflecting on how out there we are to make sure that people know that whatever we have to offer is available to them. So that might be one of the learnings that we've, it's been a bit of a common theme that people trying to access information is a very important part of survival and being able to cope. I just wonder, there's a couple of other people in the room. Is there any other final reflections or comments that people would like to share? Is there a final comment from you, Mary Jean, for example?
I'm very grateful, and I'm very impressed that you had researched and studied this issue, coronavirus, in order to help vulnerable people more effectively. So this is really, for me, it's very impressed. So thank you very much, Zara and Susan and Chandler as well. This is a very rich forum for me. And another one is, it was interesting to hear that women highly educated in Australia, but their remuneration is lower than men. It's interesting. And also very interesting that if government or services centers and services to supplement the people who are poor, it's more easily to get up or to improve their condition. It's yeah.
That's true, and Mary Jean, thank you for your sharing. And also, it does tell us that it very much depends on the political appetite of each country and also their capacity, in terms of their own resources to be able to do it. It varies quite a lot over, particularly the neighbourhood that we're aware of, the Asia Pacific. It's quite obviously very varied. The other Teresa Song, are you still with us? Is there anything you would like to share, Teresa? You need to unmute, sister, if you would. Can you unmute yourself? Go on, sorry. Go on, that's fine now.
I'm grateful to you have this forum, and Marijin already shared our situation. So
good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. Very good. Okay. Well, look, I think, this has been a very great time to spend together and a lot of information. The document is on the Google app, I think, Teresa, isn't it? It's there. It's available for people who would like to look at it further. And I'm very conscious that it's a very, in a way, a bit of quite a privileged position that we are in. But there are lots of learnings, I hope, that people can take from the research that we did and the insights that we gained. And I'd like to thank Susan and Zara for putting it together so well. It really certainly helps us to see where the key issues for improvement are, and also some of the learnings that we may be able to act on as we go forward. But we are all certainly on alert, I think, for the next 12 months with our most vulnerable. And it also, for me, says, of course, why a Good Shepherd in the work we do with women and girls, because they are the most vulnerable across the whole region and the world, probably. So we're in the right place, I think, working with this group, and let's continue to advance the cause of women and girls in our community. So thank you for staying with us and for sharing, and for all those who are on the YouTube, thank you for listening. It's been a very important afternoon session. And thank you, Teresa, for hosting us. We'll leave you now to go on with your day, and thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the sessions as they come up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sandra.
Thank you. Thank you, Zara. And
Susan.
Susan, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.